Eleanor stood in the narrow hallway of her apartment, staring at the envelope in her hands as if it were something foreign, something that didn't belong in the chaotic wreckage of her current life. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that spoke of old institutions and unspoken formality. Her name was written across the front in elegant script, but it felt detached, impersonal, like a summons rather than a greeting. She had just returned from clearing out her desk at the marketing firm where she'd worked for 6 years. A cardboard box of belongings still sitting by the door like evidence of failure. The air in the apartment felt heavy, stale, as if even the walls knew what had happened between her and Daniel the night before. The letter had been waiting for her, slipped beneath the door by the building's caretaker. She turned it over slowly, studying the return address. A law firm she'd never heard of, located in a town whose name she vaguely recognized but couldn't place. For a moment, she considered not opening it at all. There was something unsettling about receiving formal correspondence during a week when everything else in her life had already fallen apart. But curiosity, or perhaps desperation for distraction, made her slide her finger beneath the seal and pull out the single page inside. The words were formal, almost cold in their precision. They informed her that a certain Catherine Ashford, her maternal aunt, had passed away 3 months prior, and that Eleanor had been named as the sole beneficiary of her estate. The estate, the letter explained, consisted primarily of a mansion located in the village of Greystone, along with its contents and surrounding land. There were instructions for contacting the firm to arrange a visit, but no further details about the woman herself, no explanation for why Eleanor had been chosen, no acknowledgement of the fact that Eleanor had never even heard her aunt's name spoken aloud in her entire life. Eleanor sank onto the couch, the letter still clutched in her hand, and tried to piece together what little she knew. Her mother had never mentioned having a sister. In all the years of family gatherings, holidays, and quiet evenings at home, there had been no stories, no photographs, no whispered references to a relative who lived somewhere far away. It was as if Catherine Ashford had been deliberately erased from the family narrative, her existence scrubbed clean from memory. And now, in death, she had reached out to Eleanor with an inheritance that felt less like a gift and more like an accusation, a reminder of something lost or hidden. The timing felt cruel. Just yesterday, Eleanor had sat across from her manager and been told, in carefully rehearsed corporate language, that her position was being eliminated due to restructuring. The words had been kind, apologetic even, but the result was the same. She was unemployed, adrift, with bills to pay and no clear path forward. And the night before that, Daniel had packed a bag and left, his face tight with frustration and disappointment, telling her he couldn't do this anymore, couldn't keep waiting for her to figure out what she wanted from life. The apartment still smelled faintly of his cologne, a ghost of intimacy that now felt like mockery. Eleanor looked around the small living room, at the mismatched furniture and half-empty bookshelves, at the life she'd built that suddenly felt insufficient. She had spent years convincing herself that stability was enough, that a decent job and a comfortable relationship were all she needed to feel whole. But the truth was, she'd been numb for a long time, going through the motions without ever asking herself if she was truly happy. And now, with everything stripped away, she was left with nothing but the raw, uncomfortable realization that she didn't know who she was anymore. The letter sat on her lap, a tangible reminder that somewhere out there, a woman she'd never met had thought of her, had chosen her, had left her something significant. Eleanor didn't know whether to feel grateful or angry. Why had Catherine never reached out while she was alive? Why had she waited until death to make herself known? The questions circled in Eleanor's mind, unanswered and frustrating, but beneath them was something else, a faint, fragile thread of curiosity. What kind of woman leaves her entire estate to a niece she's never met? What kind of life had Catherine lived in that mansion, alone and forgotten? Eleanor folded the letter carefully and set it on the coffee table. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifferent rhythm, people moving through their lives without pause or reflection. She thought about the mansion in Greystone, imagined it standing silent and empty in some quiet countryside, waiting. She didn't know what she would find there, didn't know if going would bring her answers or only more questions. But for the first time in days, she felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not exactly, But it was close enough. It was the possibility of something different, something unknown, and right now that was more than she had anywhere else. The train left the city at dawn, and Eleanor watched through the window as the landscape transformed with each passing mile. At first, the buildings simply grew shorter, the streets less crowded, the noise of urban life fading into something quieter, more restrained. But as the hours stretched on, the change became more profound. The concrete and glass gave way to open fields, rolling hills dotted with sheep, and stretches of woodland that looked untouched by progress. The sky seemed wider here, less confined, though the clouds hung low and gray, casting everything in a muted, almost melancholic light. Eleanor had left her apartment early that morning with a single suitcase and a sense of detachment that surprised her. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, hadn't bothered to explain herself to friends who would only ask questions she couldn't answer. The decision to visit Greystone had been made quietly, almost impulsively, in the days following the letter's arrival. She told herself it was practical. She needed to see the property, assess its value, decide whether to sell or hold on to it. But beneath that logic was something deeper, a pull she didn't fully understand, a need to know who Catherine Ashford had been and why she had chosen Eleanor as her heir. The train station at Greystone was small, little more than a platform with a weathered wooden shelter and a single bench. Eleanor was the only passenger to disembark, and as the train pulled away, the silence that settled over the platform felt almost oppressive. The air smelled different here, clean, but tinged with earth and dampness, as if rain had recently passed through. She stood for a moment, adjusting the strap of her bag, and looked around. The village itself was visible in the distance, a cluster of stone buildings and narrow streets that seemed to cling to the hillside like something reluctant to let go. She walked toward the village center, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestone path. The few people she passed offered polite nods but avoided her gaze, their expressions carefully neutral. Eleanor tried to dismiss the feeling creeping up her spine, the sense that she was being observed and judged in ways she couldn't see. She stopped at a small general store, its windows cluttered with handwritten advertisements and jars of local honey, and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, and an elderly woman behind the counter looked up from her knitting, her eyes sharp and assessing. Eleanor asked about directions to the Ashford estate, her voice steady but polite. The woman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something between pity and disapproval crossing her weathered face. She set down her knitting slowly, as if choosing her words with care, and told Eleanor the mansion was about 2 miles north, up the old road past the church. Her tone was measured, but there was an undercurrent Eleanor couldn't quite place, a warning wrapped in civility. When Eleanor thanked her and turned to leave, the woman spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost reluctant. She said that some houses hold more than memories, that places like the Ashford estate carry the weight of what happened within their walls, and that Eleanor should be careful. Eleanor paused, her hand on the door, and turned back. She wanted to ask what the woman meant, wanted to press for details, but something in the older woman's expression told her the conversation was over. Eleanor nodded, offered a tight smile, and left the shop. Outside, the street felt colder, the sky darker, though the hour hadn't changed. She walked past a small cafe where a group of men sat drinking coffee, their conversation halting as she passed. One of them muttered something she couldn't quite hear, and another shook his head in response, his face solemn. Eleanor kept walking, her unease growing with each step. The road to the estate wound through fields and past crumbling stone walls that spoke of a time when this land had been more prosperous, more alive. Eleanor tried to dismiss the shopkeeper's words as small-town superstition, the kind of folklore that clings to old places and refuses to let go. But the warning lingered in her mind, persistent and unsettling. She thought about Catherine, about a woman who had lived in isolation in a house that inspired such strange reactions from the people who remained. What had happened here? What had Catherine done, or what had been done to her, that left such a shadow over this place? As Eleanor crested a hill, the mansion came into view. It stood at the end of a long tree-lined drive, its Gothic silhouette stark against the overcast sky. The stone was dark, almost black in the dim light, and ivy clung to the walls like something trying to reclaim the structure for nature. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass reflecting nothing, as if the house itself refused to give anything away. Eleanor stopped walking, her breath catching in her chest. The mansion was beautiful in a haunting, melancholic way, but it was also imposing, almost forbidding, as if it held secrets it had no intention of sharing. She stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging at her coat, and felt the weight of the journey settle over her. This place was not just an inheritance. It was a puzzle, a question without an answer, and she was walking straight into its silence. Eleanor adjusted her bag, took a deep breath, and started down the drive toward the house that waited for her. The iron gate at the entrance to the estate groaned as Eleanor pushed it open, the sound echoing across the empty grounds like a warning. The hinges were rusted, the metal cold beneath her fingers, and she had to use both hands to force it wide enough to pass through. Beyond the gate, the driveway stretched ahead, lined with ancient oak trees whose bare branches formed a skeletal canopy overhead. Fallen leaves carpeted the gravel path, undisturbed and thick, as if no one had walked this way in months, perhaps years. Eleanor stepped forward slowly, her suitcase wheels crunching against the debris, and felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The mansion rose before her like something from another century, its Gothic architecture both beautiful and unsettling. The stone walls were dark gray, almost black in places where moisture and age had left their marks, and thick ropes of ivy climbed the facade, weaving through the stonework as if trying to pull the structure back into the earth. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass clouded with grime, reflecting nothing but the overcast sky above. There were turrets at the corners, pointed and imposing, and ornate carvings framed the heavy wooden door at the entrance. It was the kind of house that belonged in old novels, in stories of inheritance and tragedy, and standing before it now, Eleanor felt a strange mix of awe and trepidation. She climbed the stone steps to the front door, her breath visible in the cold air, and reached for the brass handle. It turned easily, surprisingly so, and the door swung inward with a low creak that seemed to fill the entire space. Eleanor hesitated on the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond, and then stepped inside. The air hit her immediately, thick, stale, heavy with dust and the faint scent of mildew. It was the smell of a place that had been closed off from the world, left to its own slow decay. She fumbled for a light switch along the wall, her fingers brushing against cool plaster, and when she found it and flipped it upward, a dim glow filled the entrance hall. The interior was both grander and more desolate than she had imagined. The floor was made of dark wood, scuffed and worn but still bearing the traces of what must have once been a polished elegance. A wide staircase curved upward to the second floor, its banister carved with intricate patterns that spoke of craftsmanship and care. But everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, and cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten drapery. Eleanor set her suitcase down and walked further into the hall, her footsteps muffled by the thick silence. To her left, a sitting room opened up, its furniture still in place. A velvet sofa, a pair of armchairs, a low table with a stack of books piled neatly on its surface. It looked as if someone had simply stood up one day and walked away, leaving everything exactly as it was. She moved through the rooms slowly, cataloging what she found with a mixture of fascination and unease. In the dining room, the table was set with fine china, the plates dusty but still arranged as if waiting for guests who would never arrive. In the library, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes whose spines bore titles in languages Eleanor didn't recognize. A reading chair sat by the window, a knitted blanket draped over its arm, and beside it, a pair of reading glasses rested on a small side table. Eleanor picked them up carefully, feeling the weight of them in her hand, and wondered how many hours Catherine had spent in this chair, looking out at the grounds, lost in thought. Everywhere she looked, there were traces of a life interrupted. Photographs hung on the walls, some in ornate frames, others simple and unadorned. They depicted people Eleanor didn't recognize. Stern-faced men in formal attire, women in elegant dresses, children captured mid-laugh in gardens that must have once been lush and vibrant. But there were no recent photographs, nothing that suggested Catherine had maintained connections with the outside world in her later years. Eleanor paused before one particular image, a portrait of a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a faint, enigmatic smile. She wondered if this was Catherine, captured in a moment before whatever had happened to her, before the isolation and silence. Upstairs, the bedrooms were equally untouched. The master bedroom was large, its four-poster bed made with precision, the coverlet smooth and undisturbed. A wardrobe stood against one wall, its doors slightly ajar, revealing rows of dresses and coats that hung like ghosts of a former life. On the vanity, a brush still held strands of gray hair, and a small jewelry box sat open, its contents glinting faintly in the dim light. Eleanor felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Sadness, perhaps, or guilt. She was standing in the remnants of a woman's existence, a woman who had lived and died without ever making herself known to the world, without ever reaching out to the family who had forgotten her. Eleanor returned to the entrance hall and stood at the base of the staircase, looking around at the house that was now, inexplicably, hers. It felt wrong, somehow, to be here, to claim ownership over something that still felt so deeply inhabited by the presence of someone else. She wasn't sure what she had expected to find. Answers, perhaps, or clarity. But instead, she felt only a deepening sense of mystery. Who had Catherine been? Why had she lived this way? And why, in the end, had she left all of this to Eleanor, a niece she had never met? The silence of the house pressed in around her, vast and patient, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Eleanor woke to pale morning light filtering through the dust-coated windows of the master bedroom, where she had spent the night wrapped in blankets she'd found in a cedar chest. The house had been cold and unsettling in the darkness. Every creak and groan of old would amplified by the silence, but exhaustion had eventually overtaken her unease. Now, in the gray light of day, the mansion felt less menacing and more melancholic, like a grand theater after the audience had gone home. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, drawn by an instinct she couldn't quite explain toward the room she had glimpsed the evening before. A study tucked away at the end of the first-floor hallway. The door to the study opened with a soft resistance, as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. Inside, the room was smaller than the others, more intimate, and it felt different somehow, more personal. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but unlike the formal library she had seen earlier, these shelves were cluttered and lived in, filled not just with books but with papers, folders, and stacks of correspondence tied with faded ribbon. A large wooden desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with more papers, a leather-bound journal lying open as if Catherine had set it down mid-thought and simply never returned. Eleanor stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by a worn Persian rug, and felt an immediate sense of intrusion, as if she were trespassing on something sacred. She approached the desk slowly, her fingers trailing along the edge, and looked down at the journal. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink slightly smudged in places, and the entries were dated sporadically over several years. Eleanor hesitated, her conscience warring with her curiosity, but the need to understand outweighed her reservations. She sat down in the chair, its leather cracked and soft with age, and began to read. Catherine's words were measured but raw, chronicling not the events of daily life, but the internal landscape of a woman grappling with isolation and regret. She wrote about the village, about the judgment she felt in every glance and whispered conversation, about the loneliness of living in a place where she was both present and invisible. Eleanor turned the pages carefully, absorbing the portrait of a woman she had never known but was beginning to understand. Catherine had been intelligent. That much was clear from the precision of her language and the depth of her reflections. She referenced books she had read, ideas she had considered, questions she had wrestled with about morality, duty, and the cost of living authentically. But beneath the intellectual rigor was a profound sadness, a sense of having been cast out from something she had once valued. She wrote about her family only in fragments, never naming names directly, but the pain in those passages was unmistakable. There were references to a sister who had chosen silence over solidarity, to parents who had prioritized reputation over compassion, to a life that had been shaped by decisions made by others. Eleanor set the journal aside and turned her attention to the letters. They were bundled together in stacks, organized by date and sender, and as she sifted through them, a clearer picture began to emerge. Many were formal correspondences, bills, legal documents, notices from the village council, but others were deeply personal. There were letters from friends who had eventually stopped writing, their words growing shorter and more strained with each exchange, as if maintaining the relationship had become too burdensome. And then there were the letters from family, or rather, the absence of them. Eleanor found only a few, and most were decades old, written in a hand she recognized with a sudden, uncomfortable jolt. It was her mother's handwriting, unmistakable in its careful, controlled script. She pulled those letters out carefully, her heart beating faster, and began to read. The earliest was dated nearly 40 years ago, and it was cold in a way that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. Her mother, then a young woman, had written to Catherine demanding that she not contact the family again, accusing her of bringing shame upon them, of making choices that had consequences for everyone, not just herself. The tone was harsh, self-righteous, and utterly unforgiving. There was no inquiry into Catherine's well-being, no attempt at understanding, only condemnation. The subsequent letters were shorter, responses to Catherine's attempts at reconciliation, each one more dismissive than the last, until finally, there were no more. The correspondence had simply ended, leaving only silence in its wake. Eleanor sat back in the chair, the letters trembling in her hands. She felt a wave of emotion crash over her. Anger at her mother, sorrow for Catherine, and a deep, unsettling shame for the family she belonged to. What had Catherine done to deserve such rejection? The letters offered no specifics, only vague references to scandal and impropriety, but whatever had happened, it was clear that the family had chosen to protect their reputation rather than stand by one of their own. Eleanor thought about her mother, about the woman who had raised her with strict expectations and an emphasis on appearances, and realized that the same impulse that had driven her to sever ties with Catherine still lived in her, carefully buried beneath layers of respectability. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the overgrown gardens and the distant hills beyond. She had come here expecting to find a house, perhaps some valuable antiques, maybe a story she could tell at dinner parties about the eccentric relative she'd never met. But instead, she had stumbled into something far more complicated. A legacy of silence, judgment, and unresolved pain. Catherine hadn't just left her a mansion. She had left her a question, one that demanded an answer Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to give. Who had Catherine really been, and why had the family been so determined to erase her? Eleanor was in the kitchen attempting to make sense of the ancient stove when she heard the knock at the front door. The sound startled her, sharp and deliberate against the backdrop of silence that had become almost companionable over the past 2 days. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and made her way through the dim hallway, her footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floor. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, she could make out the blurred silhouette of a woman, her posture patient and unhurried. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before pulling the door open, the hinges protesting with their familiar groan. The woman on the doorstep was perhaps in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back into a practical bun and eyes that carried the kind of warmth that comes from genuine concern rather than obligation. She wore a simple wool coat over a floral dress, and in her hands, she held a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. She smiled, though there was a cautiousness to it, as if she were uncertain of her welcome. She introduced herself as Margaret Hayes, said she lived in the cottage just beyond the eastern edge of the estate, and explained that she'd noticed someone had finally arrived at the Ashford house. Her voice was soft but clear, and there was a steadiness to her presence that put Eleanor slightly at ease. Eleanor invited her inside, grateful for the company even as she felt the weight of her own disheveled appearance. Unwashed hair, wrinkled clothes, the faint smell of dust clinging to her skin. Margaret stepped into the entrance hall and looked around with an expression that was both nostalgic and sad, as if she were seeing not just the house as it was now, but as it had once been. She commented quietly that it had been a long time since anyone had opened these doors, and Eleanor detected a note of relief in her voice, as if the house had been waiting too long in its solitude. They moved to the sitting room, where Eleanor cleared a space on the sofa and Margaret set the basket down on the low table, pulling back the cloth to reveal fresh bread, a jar of homemade preserves, and a covered dish that smelled of herbs and roasted vegetables. Margaret explained that she'd heard from the shopkeeper in the village that Catherine's niece had arrived, and she'd wanted to stop by, to offer what help she could. There was no presumption in her words, no expectation of gratitude or friendship, only a simple kindness that felt rare in Eleanor's recent experience. They sat together in the fading afternoon light, and Margaret poured tea from a thermos she'd brought, her movements practiced and efficient. Eleanor thanked her, her voice more emotional than she'd intended, and Margaret smiled again, this time with less caution, as if something between them had shifted. The conversation began tentatively, with polite questions about Eleanor's journey and how she was managing in the house. But gradually, as the tea warmed them and the silence between words became comfortable rather than awkward, Margaret began to speak about Catherine. She said she had known her, not well, but better than most in the village. Catherine had been a private woman, she explained, but not unkind. She had kept to herself, yes, but on the rare occasions when their paths crossed, she had always been courteous, even generous. Margaret recalled a winter years ago when her own husband had fallen ill, and Catherine had sent over firewood without being asked, along with a note that was brief but thoughtful. It was the kind of gesture that spoke of someone who understood hardship but preferred to help quietly, without fanfare or expectation of recognition. Eleanor listened carefully, trying to reconcile this image of Catherine with the isolated, sorrowful woman she had encountered in the journals. She asked Margaret why Catherine had lived so alone, why the village seemed to regard her with such unease. Margaret's expression shifted then, becoming more guarded, and she set her teacup down slowly, her fingers tracing the rim as if buying time to choose her words. She said that Catherine had been the subject of gossip once, years ago, something that had happened when Margaret herself was still young. She didn't know all the details, she admitted only what people said, and people often said things that were shaped more by judgment than truth. There had been a scandal, something involving a relationship that the village deemed inappropriate, and Catherine had borne the weight of that judgment for the rest of her life. Margaret's tone was careful, but Eleanor could hear the implication beneath her words. The village had decided who Catherine was based on a single chapter of her life, and they had never allowed her to move beyond it. Margaret didn't defend Catherine outright, but she didn't condemn her either. Instead, she spoke with the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand that most stories were more complicated than they appeared, that people were rarely as simple as the labels placed upon them. She said that Catherine had been intelligent, that much was clear to anyone who spoke with her, and that she had carried herself with a kind of dignity that some mistook for arrogance but was really just self-preservation. Eleanor felt something shift inside her as Margaret spoke, a softening of the frustration and confusion she had carried since arriving. Catherine was no longer just a name on a legal document or a shadow in an empty house. She was becoming real, a woman who had lived with grace under the weight of judgment, who had made choices that others couldn't forgive, and who had spent her life paying for them in silence. Eleanor asked Margaret if she thought Catherine had been happy, and Margaret paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said she didn't know, but she hoped that in her own way, Catherine had found some measure of peace. When Margaret finally left, the basket lighter and the house feeling less empty, Eleanor stood at the door and watched her walk down the driveway. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds, and for the first time since arriving, Eleanor felt she was beginning to understand the inheritance she had been given. Eleanor had spent the better part of the morning on the second floor, methodically opening doors and cataloging rooms that seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation. Most were bedrooms, each furnished with care but untouched for what must have been years, their curtains drawn against the light, their air thick with the smell of old fabric and forgotten time. She had begun to feel a strange rhythm to the house, a pattern in its layout that spoke of a life organized around solitude and routine. But it was in the smallest bedroom, tucked at the end of a narrow hallway, that she noticed something unusual. The room itself was unremarkable. A single bed with a faded quilt, a nightstand with a tarnished lamp, and against the far wall, a tall bookshelf filled with volumes that looked more decorative than read. But as Eleanor ran her hand along the spines, feeling the embossed titles beneath her fingertips, she noticed that the shelf didn't sit flush against the wall. There was a gap, barely perceptible, and when she leaned closer, she could feel a faint draft of cooler air coming from behind it. Her pulse quickened. She pressed her palms against the side of the bookshelf and pushed gently. It resisted at first, but then, with a low grinding sound, it swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow doorway and a space beyond that had been completely concealed. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, her breath caught in her chest. The door behind the bookshelf was painted the same color as the wall, designed to disappear, and it was locked with a small brass mechanism that looked old but functional. Her mind raced. Why would Catherine hide a room? What could possibly be inside that required such secrecy? She thought immediately of the study downstairs, of the journals and letters, and wondered if this hidden space held answers to the questions that had been gnawing at her since she arrived. She needed to find the key. It took her nearly an hour of searching through drawers, boxes, and the pockets of coats hanging in Catherine's wardrobe before she finally found it. The key was small, tarnished with age, tucked inside a velvet pouch at the bottom of a jewelry box on the vanity. Eleanor held it up to the light, turning it over in her hand, and felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. She returned to the hidden door, inserted the key into the lock, and turned it slowly. The mechanism clicked, the sound sharp in the silence, and the door swung open to reveal a room bathed in soft, dusty light filtering through a single high window. Eleanor stepped inside, and the breath left her body. The room was small, no larger than a modest closet, but every inch of it was alive with color and emotion. Canvases leaned against the walls, stacked 3 and 4 deep, some finished, others half complete, and still others bearing only rough sketches in charcoal and pencil. An easel stood in the center of the room, a painting resting on it that looked as though Catherine had set down her brush mid-stroke and never returned. The floor was splattered with paint, the walls were pinned with sketches and studies, and in the corner, a small table held jars of brushes, tubes of paint squeezed nearly flat, and rags stained with every color imaginable. It was a studio, intimate and hidden, a space where Catherine had poured herself into her work away from the judgment of the world. Eleanor moved slowly through the room, her eyes sweeping over the paintings, trying to take in the sheer volume of what Catherine had created. The subjects varied: landscapes, portraits, abstract compositions. But there was a consistency in the emotional tone that was impossible to ignore. The work was raw, unguarded, filled with a kind of vulnerability that Eleanor had not seen anywhere else in the house. One painting depicted a woman sitting alone at a window, her face turned toward the light, her expression caught between hope and resignation. Another showed a garden overgrown and wild, beautiful in its abandon but tinged with melancholy. There were portraits of people Eleanor didn't recognize, rendered with such detail and empathy that she felt she could understand their inner lives just by looking at them. But it was the unfinished painting on the easel that held her attention longest. It was a self-portrait, Eleanor realized, though it took her a moment to recognize Catherine from the photograph she had seen downstairs. The woman in the painting was older, her face lined with age and experience, but her eyes were fierce, defiant even, as if she were daring the viewer to judge her. The background was dark, almost oppressive, but Catherine's figure was illuminated, standing out against the shadows with a quiet strength that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Eleanor stood before it, her hand pressed to her chest, and felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Catherine had been an artist, not a hobbyist, not someone who dabbled for amusement, but a true artist with talent and vision and something urgent to say. And yet, none of this had ever been seen. None of these paintings had hung in galleries or been admired by strangers. They had been hidden away, locked behind a false wall, as if Catherine believed they had no place in the world, or perhaps, as if the world had no place for them. Eleanor thought about the letters from her mother, about the village's whispered judgment, about the life Catherine had lived in isolation, and she understood. This room was Catherine's sanctuary, the one place where she could exist fully and honestly, without apology or explanation. Eleanor sank down onto the paint-stained floor, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived in secret, and felt the weight of what had been lost. Catherine had deserved to be known, to be celebrated, to have her work seen and valued. But instead, she had hidden herself away, convinced, or perhaps forced to believe, that her voice was unwelcome. Eleanor looked around the room, at the canvases and sketches, at the traces of a woman who had refused to stop creating even when no one was watching, and made a silent promise. This would not remain hidden. Catherine's story, her art, her truth. It would be brought into the light. Eleanor had been examining the paintings in the hidden studio for hours, carefully lifting each canvas to study the brushwork and composition, when she noticed that one of the larger pieces, a landscape of windswept moors beneath a turbulent sky, felt heavier than it should. She turned it over and found a small envelope taped to the back of the frame, yellowed with age and sealed with wax that had long since cracked. Her hands trembled slightly as she peeled it away, careful not to damage the fragile paper. And when she opened it, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbons slipped into her palm. The handwriting on the envelopes was masculine, precise, and the return address was simply a name: Thomas Brennan. She carried the letters to the window where the light was better and untied the ribbon slowly, feeling as though she were opening something sacred, something never meant for her eyes. The paper was thin, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still legible, and as Eleanor began to read, she felt herself drawn into a story that was both intimate and heartbreaking. The earliest letter was dated more than 30 years ago, and Thomas's words were careful, restrained, as if he were testing the boundaries of what he could say. He wrote about seeing Catherine at a village event, about how she had stood apart from the others, elegant and composed, and how he had felt compelled to speak to her despite knowing it was unwise. He apologized for the forwardness of his words but confessed that he could not stop thinking about her. The subsequent letters grew more passionate, more desperate. Thomas wrote of stolen moments, of conversations that lasted late into the evening, of a connection that felt both inevitable and impossible. He spoke of his life, of the obligations that bound him, and though he never stated it explicitly in the early letters, Eleanor began to understand the situation. Thomas had been married. The relationship with Catherine had been an affair, conducted in secrecy and shadow, and the weight of that transgression hung over every word he wrote. He spoke of his guilt, of the conflict between his duty and his heart, but he also spoke of Catherine with a reverence that was unmistakable. She was, he wrote, the only person who had ever truly understood him, who had seen beyond the roles he played and recognized the man beneath. But as the letters progressed, the tone shifted. Thomas wrote of pressure from his family, of rumors spreading through the village, of Catherine being blamed for a situation that was as much his fault as hers. He wrote of arguments, of Catherine's growing isolation, of his own cowardice in the face of social judgment. And then, in the final letter dated several years after the first, he wrote of his decision to end the relationship. His words were anguished, filled with self-recrimination, but also resignation. He could not leave his wife, he explained, could not abandon his responsibilities, no matter how hollow they felt. He begged Catherine to forgive him, not for the affair, but for his weakness, for choosing the safe path over the honest one. He told her he would carry his regret for the rest of his life, and he hoped, someday, she might find peace without him. Eleanor set the letters down, her chest tight with emotion. This was the scandal Margaret had alluded to, the reason the village had judged Catherine so harshly. She had fallen in love with a married man, and when the truth came out, she alone had borne the consequences. Thomas had returned to his life, protected by his position and his family, while Catherine had been cast out, her reputation destroyed, her isolation complete. Eleanor felt a surge of anger on her aunt's behalf, but beneath it was something deeper, a sorrow for all the lives shaped by fear and propriety, for all the love that had been sacrificed to preserve appearances. She spent the rest of the afternoon searching for information about Thomas Brennan, and with the help of the village records and a few discreet inquiries, she learned that he was still alive, living in a neighboring town less than 20 miles away. Her hands shook as she dialed the number listed for his residence, and when a voice answered, aged, cautious, but unmistakably the same man whose words she had just read. She introduced herself simply as Catherine's niece. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, so long that Eleanor thought he might have hung up, but then Thomas spoke, his voice thick with emotion, and agreed to meet her. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in his town 2 days later. Eleanor arrived early, her nerves frayed, and sat by the window watching people pass on the street. When Thomas finally entered, she recognized him immediately, though not from any photograph but from the way he carried himself, shoulders slightly bent, eyes scanning the room with a mixture of hope and dread. He was tall, his frame still strong despite his age, but there was a weariness to him, a heaviness that seemed to pull at every step. When their eyes met, something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the grief they both carried for the woman who had connected them. Thomas sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor could see the decades of sorrow etched into his face, the lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of regret worn smooth by time but never truly erased. He asked her quietly how she had found him, and when she mentioned the letters, his expression crumbled. He closed his eyes, his jaw tight, and Eleanor understood that this meeting was not just difficult for him. It was a reckoning he had been avoiding for most of his life. She reached across the table, her hand hovering near his, and told him softly that she needed to understand what had happened, that Catherine deserved to have her story told truthfully. Thomas nodded, his eyes glistening, and began to speak. Thomas spoke slowly, his voice steady but threaded with a tremor that betrayed the effort it took to revisit memories he had spent decades trying to bury. He began not with Catherine, but with his marriage, explaining that he had wed young, at the insistence of his father, to a woman from a prominent local family. It had been an arrangement more than a romance, a union designed to consolidate property and social standing rather than to nurture affection. His wife had been dutiful, he said, and he had been respectful, but there had been no warmth between them, no genuine connection. They had lived together for years in a state of polite coexistence, sharing a home but little else, and he had convinced himself that this was simply what marriage was, a structure to be maintained, not a source of joy. He had met Catherine at a charity event organized by the village council. He continued, his eyes distant as if he were seeing her again as she had been then. She had been in her early 30s, unmarried, which was already a source of quiet judgment in a place where women were expected to have settled into domestic life by their mid-20s. But Catherine had carried herself with a self-possession that set her apart, an intelligence and independence that both intrigued and unnerved the people around her. Thomas had been drawn to her immediately, though he had tried to resist. They had begun talking, cautiously at first, about books and ideas, about the world beyond the narrow confines of village life, and he had felt, for the first time in years, truly seen by another person. The affair had begun almost inevitably, he admitted, his voice dropping lower, weighted with shame. It had started with conversations that lasted too long, with meetings that were ostensibly accidental but carefully arranged, and eventually with moments of intimacy that both of them knew were dangerous but could not resist. Thomas described Catherine as someone who had loved fiercely and without pretense, who had understood the risks but had chosen to love him anyway. She had never asked him to leave his wife, he said, had never demanded promises or futures, but she had given him a version of himself he had thought lost. A man capable of passion, of honesty, of feeling deeply. For a time, they had managed to keep the relationship hidden, but in a village like Greystone, secrets were fragile things. Someone had seen them together, or perhaps someone had simply guessed, and the rumors had begun to spread. At first, they were whispers, sidelong glances, but they grew louder and more vicious until the affair was no longer a private matter but a public scandal. Thomas's family had been horrified, he explained, not because of any moral outrage but because of the damage to their reputation. His father had been a man of considerable influence, and the thought of his son being associated with such impropriety had been intolerable. Thomas had been summoned, lectured, and ultimately given an ultimatum: end the relationship or be disowned. Eleanor watched him as he spoke, seeing the way his hands clenched and unclenched on the table, the way his jaw tightened with each admission. He told her that he had chosen his reputation, his family, his standing in the community, over Catherine. He had gone to her and ended things, not because he wanted to, but because he had been too weak to do otherwise. He had told himself it was the responsible choice, the right choice, but even as he said the words to Catherine, he had known it was cowardice. She had not begged or cried, he said, his voice breaking slightly. She had simply looked at him with an expression of profound sadness and acceptance, as if she had known all along that this was how it would end. But while Thomas had been able to return to his life, albeit diminished, Catherine had not been afforded the same grace. She had been the one vilified, labeled as the seductress, the immoral woman who had tried to destroy a marriage. The village had turned against her with a cruelty that shocked even Thomas, who had thought he understood the harshness of social judgment. She had been excluded from gatherings, whispered about in shops, and treated as a pariah. Her own family had been no better, he said, his voice hardening with anger directed not at them but at the world that had created such conditions. Her parents had been ashamed, more concerned with their reputation than with their daughter's well-being, and her sister, Eleanor's mother, had been the most unforgiving of all. She had severed contact completely, writing letters that accused Catherine of bringing shame upon the family, of being selfish and reckless, and she had never relented, not even when Catherine had tried to apologize, to explain, to reconnect. Thomas told Eleanor that he had watched from a distance as Catherine withdrew into the mansion, becoming more isolated with each passing year. He had wanted to reach out, to apologize, to tell her that he had been wrong. But he had been paralyzed by his own guilt and by the knowledge that any contact would only make things worse for her. His wife had died a decade later, he said, and he had never remarried, never sought out another relationship. He had lived alone, wealthy but hollow, carrying the weight of his choices like a stone around his neck. He had written letters to Catherine over the years, he confessed, but had never sent them, convinced that she would not want to hear from him, that he had forfeited any right to her forgiveness. Then, his hands shaking, Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft with age and handling. He told Eleanor that this was a letter Catherine had written to him, one he had found among her belongings after her death when the lawyers had contacted him to retrieve a few items she had left specifically for him. She had written it years ago, he said, but had never sent it, perhaps because she had known he didn't deserve her grace, or perhaps because she had simply wanted to put the words down for herself. He slid the letter across the table to Eleanor, his eyes brimming with tears, and asked her to read it. Eleanor unfolded the paper carefully, her own hands trembling, and read Catherine's words. They were tender, forgiving, and heartbreakingly generous. Catherine wrote that she did not blame Thomas, that she understood the pressures he had faced, and that she hoped he would not spend his life consumed by regret. She told him that their love, however brief and however condemned, had been real, and that it had given her something precious even if it had cost her everything else. She asked him to forgive himself, to live freely, to find whatever happiness he could, because holding on to guilt would serve no one. Eleanor finished reading, her vision blurred with tears, and looked up at Thomas, who was weeping quietly, his shoulders shaking with decades of grief finally released. Eleanor sat by the window of her apartment, watching the rain trace uneven paths down the glass. The city beyond was muted, softened by the late afternoon drizzle that turned everything gray and distant. She had been holding her phone for 20 minutes, thumb hovering over her mother's contact, the weight of what she was about to do pressing against her chest like something solid and unforgiving. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her mind, imagined the words she would use, the tone she would take. But now, with the call only a single press away, all those careful preparations felt thin and inadequate. There was no script for asking your mother why she had erased someone from existence. No polite way to demand an accounting of cruelty dressed up as respectability. The phone rang 3 times before her mother answered, her voice carrying that familiar blend of warmth and guardedness that Eleanor had learned to read like weather patterns. "Eleanor, darling, what a lovely surprise." "Mother." Eleanor's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need to talk to you about Aunt Catherine." The silence that followed was so complete Eleanor could hear the rain intensifying against the window, a sudden drumming that seemed to echo the acceleration of her pulse. I don't think. Please. Eleanor cut through the deflection with a firmness that surprised them both. I need to understand why the family abandoned her. Why no one spoke about her. Why she died alone. Her mother's breathing became audible on the line, a series of careful, measured inhales that Eleanor recognized as a stalling tactic, a way to gather defenses. That was a very complicated time, Eleanor. You can't possibly understand what it was like back then. Then help me understand. Eleanor stood, pacing the small length of her living room, her free hand clenched at her side. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the family threw away a woman who needed them, and everyone just agreed to pretend she never existed. It wasn't like that. But even as her mother said it, Eleanor could hear the fragility in the denial, the way it barely held together under its own weight. Catherine made choices that put the entire family at risk of scandal. Your grandfather's business, the family reputation, everything we had worked for could have been destroyed by association. Association with what? Eleanor demanded. With a woman who had a child outside marriage? With someone who chose love over approval? Her mother's voice sharpened, taking on an edge Eleanor remembered from childhood arguments. You don't know what you're talking about. In those days, that kind of thing could ruin everyone. People talked. Business partners withdrew. Social circles closed their doors. It wasn't just about Catherine. It was about all of us. Eleanor stopped pacing, staring at her reflection in the darkening window. She looked like her mother in that moment, she realized. The same line between the eyebrows, the same tension in the jaw. So you sacrificed her to protect yourselves. We asked her to give up the child. Her mother's voice had dropped lower, taking on a quality Eleanor had never heard before. Something raw and unfinished. We offered to send her away quietly, arrange an adoption through proper channels, let her come back once it was all handled. She refused. She chose that man, chose that child, over her family. She chose herself, Eleanor said quietly. She chose to be whole instead of acceptable. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the years of careful distance, of topics never discussed, of family history sanitized into simple stories with simple morals. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion, washing the city clean in a way that conversations never quite could. I was 19. Her mother's voice had changed completely now, stripped of its defensive architecture. I was 19 when it happened, and I was terrified. Terrified of my father's anger, terrified of what people would say, terrified of being marked by association. Catherine was my older sister, and I loved her, but I was so scared of becoming like her in everyone's eyes, of being judged, whispered about, excluded. Eleanor sank back into her chair, something in her chest loosening even as it ached. So you stopped talking to her. I told myself it was temporary, that once everything died down, once the talk stopped, I would reach out, bridge the gap. Her mother's breathing had become uneven, catching on words. But time passed, and the silence became its own kind of truth. It became easier to pretend she had simply moved away, faded from our lives naturally. And then more time passed, and I didn't know how to break it anymore. How do you apologize for years of absence? How do you explain that you chose comfort over courage? Eleanor felt tears on her face without having noticed them forming. She died alone, Mother. She died without anyone. I know. The words were barely a whisper. I know, and I've known for years, and I've done nothing but carry it quietly. Like carrying it made it somehow better. I was a victim of those times, of those expectations, but I was also a coward. And Catherine paid the price for my cowardice. The rain had softened again, returning to its earlier gentleness. Eleanor watched it blur the city lights into watercolor smears, thinking about the weight of choices, the compounding interest of silence, the way fear could dress itself up as duty and call itself virtuous. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. Her mother didn't respond immediately, and when she did, her voice carried an exhaustion that sounded decades deep. I'm sorry, Eleanor. For Catherine. For all of it. After they hung up, Eleanor stayed by the window as darkness settled fully over the city. She felt hollowed out but also strangely lighter, as if truth, even painful truth, weighed less than the elaborate fictions they had all been carrying. Her mother had been young and scared, shaped by forces Eleanor could only partially understand. It didn't erase the harm, but it complicated the story in ways that felt more honest, more human. Tomorrow she would continue piecing together Catherine's life. But tonight, she let herself simply sit with the complexity of it all. The messy intersections of love and fear, courage and weakness, the countless small decisions that added up to either connection or abandonment. The idea arrived not as a sudden revelation but as something that had been building in Eleanor's chest for days, accumulating weight and shape until it could no longer be ignored. She stood in the mansion's largest room, surrounded by Catherine's paintings propped against walls and stacked carefully on cloth-covered furniture, and understood with perfect clarity what needed to happen. These works, these bold, unflinching visions of a world that had refused to see their creator, deserved more than storage, more than private appreciation. They deserved witness, an exhibition. The word itself felt both simple and impossibly ambitious. Eleanor walked to the tall windows overlooking the village below, where morning mist was beginning to lift from the harbor, revealing the familiar architecture of judgment and memory. Somewhere down there were people who had known Catherine, who had turned away from her, who had chosen collective comfort over individual compassion. And somewhere down there were others who had simply inherited the silence, accepting the sanitized version of history without question, never knowing what had been erased. She would invite them all. The thought made her hands tremble slightly as she pressed them against the cool glass. This wasn't just about displaying art, it was about forcing a reckoning, about making visible what had been deliberately hidden. It was about giving Catherine the voice she had been denied, even if that voice now spoke only through color and canvas, through the honest observations of a woman who had refused to look away from difficult truths. The preparation consumed her. Eleanor began by clearing the room entirely, creating a blank space that could hold the weight of what she intended. She scrubbed floors that hadn't been properly cleaned in decades, the physical labor providing an outlet for the complicated emotions churning inside her. Each stroke of the mop, each pass of the cloth, felt like an act of devotion, preparation not just of a space but of a kind of sacred ground. Hanging the first painting was harder than she had anticipated. Eleanor stood on a ladder, holding a canvas that depicted the village church at dusk, its spire cutting into a troubled sky. Catherine had painted it with such technical skill but also with an undercurrent of something Eleanor could only describe as loneliness. The building rendered beautiful but cold, perfect but unwelcoming. Her hands shook as she positioned the wire on the hook, understanding that this simple act was irrevocable. Once these paintings were displayed, once the invitations were sent, there would be no taking it back, no retreat into the easier comfort of private grief. Margaret arrived the next afternoon, letting herself in through the front door with the confidence of someone who understood she was needed. She carried a basket of bread and cheese, practical offerings that acknowledged the work ahead, and stopped just inside the gallery room, her eyes moving slowly across the paintings Eleanor had already hung. "My God," she said quietly. "They're extraordinary." Eleanor descended the ladder, wiping dust from her hands. She saw everything so clearly, too clearly, maybe. That's probably part of what made people uncomfortable. People are always uncomfortable with clarity. Margaret set down her basket and moved closer to a portrait of a young woman, perhaps Catherine herself, whose eyes held a directness that felt almost confrontational. "It's easier to live with comforting lies than difficult truths. Your aunt refused to participate in that comfort, and the village made her pay for it. They worked together for hours, adjusting heights and angles, creating rhythms and conversations between pieces. Margaret proved to have an instinct for display, understanding how certain paintings needed space to breathe while others gained power from proximity. As they worked, she talked about spreading word through the village, about the curiosity already beginning to build among residents. "Mrs. Patterson at the bakery remembered Catherine," Margaret said, steadying a frame while Eleanor marked the wall. "She was a girl when it happened, but she remembered how suddenly Catherine just wasn't talked about anymore, like she'd been erased from a photograph. She said she'd come to the exhibition, and that she'd tell others." Eleanor felt something complicated move through her chest. gratitude mixed with apprehension, hope threaded with dread. Some people won't like this. They'll see it as dredging up old scandals, disturbing a past they've worked hard to bury. Good, Margaret said with unexpected fierceness. Let them be uncomfortable. Let them confront what their silence cost. That discomfort is long overdue. Thomas came on the third day of preparation, arriving with the late afternoon light that turned the gallery golden. He stood in the doorway much as he had that first day at the cottage, but this time his hesitation seemed born not from uncertainty about his welcome, but from the emotional weight of seeing Catherine's life work displayed with such care and intention. Eleanor watched his face as he entered, seeing decades of regret and love and loss move across his weathered features. She would have been terrified of this, he said finally, his voice rough, and she would have wanted it more than anything. He moved through the space slowly, pausing before each piece, and Eleanor understood that he was saying goodbye and hello simultaneously. Goodbye to the private Catherine he had known in fragments, hello to the artist she had been despite everything arrayed against her. When he reached the painting of the harbor at dawn, he stopped for a long time, his shoulders rising and falling with careful breaths. I posed for this one, he said quietly. She painted me out later, said the composition worked better without the figure. But I was there when she started it, early morning, both of us freezing but not wanting to leave. Eleanor came to stand beside him. I'm inviting my mother, and I'm sending word to everyone in the village who'll listen. This isn't going to be a quiet, comfortable event. Thomas nodded slowly. Catherine's life wasn't quiet or comfortable. Why should honoring it be? That evening, Eleanor sat alone in the completed gallery, surrounded by her aunt's vision made visible. The invitations were ready to be distributed. Simple cards that stated time and place without explanation or apology. Tomorrow Margaret would begin spreading them through the village, and the weight of anticipation would shift from preparation to waiting. But tonight, Eleanor let herself simply exist in this space she had created, this act of love and defiance, this refusal to let silence win. Whatever came next, whatever discomfort or revelation or reckoning the exhibition triggered, Catherine's work would be seen. Her perspective, her talent, her complicated truth would finally have audience. Outside, the village lights began appearing one by one, each window illuminating a life continuing in its patterns. Soon, some of those lives would intersect with Catherine's legacy in ways they couldn't yet anticipate. Eleanor felt the weight and rightness of that inevitability, understanding that she had set something in motion that was larger than herself, larger even than her aunt's individual story. She was challenging an entire community to look at its own reflection and decide what it saw there, complicity or compassion, judgment or understanding, the comfortable lie or the difficult truth. The morning of the exhibition arrived with a clarity that felt almost accusatory, sunlight cutting through the mansion's windows with such precision that every dust mote, every imperfection in the glass, became visible. Eleanor had been awake since dawn, moving through the gallery space with nervous energy, adjusting paintings that didn't need adjusting, repositioning the small table of refreshments, checking and rechecking that everything conveyed exactly what she intended. Not apology, not explanation, but simple, dignified presentation of a life's work that deserved attention. By mid-morning, people began to arrive. They came in small clusters, their footsteps hesitant on the gravel drive, as if approaching something that might bite. Eleanor watched from the window as the first group paused at the entrance, exchanging glances that spoke of uncertainty and curiosity in equal measure. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery led them, her silver hair catching the light, her expression carrying a determination that seemed to pull the others forward through their reluctance. Inside, the visitors moved with the careful quietness of people in a museum, though whether out of respect for art or discomfort with history, Eleanor couldn't tell. She positioned herself near the entrance, greeting each person with a simple acknowledgement, not forcing conversation but making herself available for it. Some met her eyes directly, offering small nods that might have been approval or simply recognition. Others looked away quickly, moving immediately toward the paintings as if the art itself was safer territory than human interaction. The gallery filled slowly but steadily. Eleanor recognized faces from the village, the postmaster, the woman who ran the small bookshop, Several older residents whose names she didn't know but whose bearings suggested they had been part of this community for decades. Each person brought with them an invisible weight of memory and judgment, of stories told and stories suppressed. And the room began to feel crowded not just with bodies but with all the unspoken history those bodies carried. Thomas arrived alone, dressed in clothes that looked carefully chosen. His gray hair combed back from a face that showed every one of his years. He didn't seek out Eleanor but moved directly to a painting on the far wall. A portrait of a woman at a window, her face turned partially away from the viewer, her posture suggesting both confinement and defiance. The woman's hand rested on the windowsill with such particular delicacy that Eleanor understood this was someone specific, someone remembered. She watched Thomas stand before the painting for long minutes, utterly still except for the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his breathing. His hands hung at his sides, and Eleanor saw them clench and unclench, a rhythmic gesture of emotion barely contained. The woman in the painting had Catherine's coloring, Catherine's jawline, but whether it was a self-portrait or simply an idealized vision of who Catherine might have been in different circumstances, Eleanor couldn't determine. What was clear was the strength in the painted figure, a quiet, uncompromising strength that refused to perform remorse or shame. Other visitors began to notice Thomas, to register his presence and his obvious emotional connection to the work. Conversations that had been happening in careful whispers shifted, becoming slightly less guarded. An elderly man Eleanor didn't recognize approached Thomas, said something too quiet for her to hear, and Thomas nodded without turning away from the painting. The two men stood together in silence, and Eleanor understood she was witnessing a moment of collective memory being tentatively, carefully shared. Her mother arrived nearly an hour after the exhibition had begun, slipping in through the door with a furtiveness that suggested she had been waiting outside, gathering courage. She wore a dark blue dress that Eleanor recognized from formal family occasions, armor disguised as propriety. Their eyes met across the gallery, and Eleanor saw her mother's face cycle through emotions too quickly to name. Fear, shame, determination, love. She gave a small nod, which her mother returned, and then they both looked away, allowing each other the dignity of privacy in this public space. Eleanor watched her mother move through the gallery with visible discomfort, her shoulders tight, her movements careful and controlled. She paused before a painting of the village square at twilight, her hand rising unconsciously to her throat as if trying to contain something threatening to escape. The painting showed the square empty except for a single figure in the distance, too far away to identify but rendered with enough care to suggest importance. Her mother stared at it for so long that Eleanor nearly went to her, but something held her back. An instinct that this was a conversation her mother needed to have alone, with the past, with Catherine's vision of their shared world. Gradually, the tone in the gallery shifted. Initial whispers gave way to actual conversations, people beginning to discuss the paintings with something approaching honest engagement. Eleanor heard fragments as she moved through the space. Comments on technique, on color choices, on the way Catherine had captured light on water, the particular quality of coastal fog. But beneath the artistic observations, she heard something else emerging. A tentative reassessment, a slow recognition that they were looking at work of genuine quality created by someone they had dismissed as merely scandalous. A middle-aged woman Eleanor didn't know approached her, clutching a worn handbag against her chest like a shield. "My mother knew Catherine," she said quietly. "Before everything happened. She said Catherine was kind to her when she was a girl, helped her learn to draw. My mother always regretted losing touch with her, but she was too afraid of what people would say if she maintained the friendship." Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly. "Thank you for telling me that." The woman nodded, her eyes damp. "I wish I'd been brave enough to find her before she died, to tell her that her kindness mattered, that someone remembered her as more than a scandal." As afternoon light began to slant differently through the windows, warming the gallery to amber and gold, Eleanor realized the mansion had transformed. Where it had been a monument to silence and shame, it had become, however temporarily, however imperfectly, a space where truth could exist without apology. People lingered longer than she had anticipated, returning to certain paintings multiple times, discovering new details with each viewing. Her mother sat on a bench before a landscape of the coastline. Her face composed but her hands twisted together in her lap, working through emotions decades in the making. Thomas remained before the portrait of the woman at the window, and when Eleanor finally approached him in the late afternoon, he spoke without looking away from the canvas. She painted this the year before she died. I asked her who it was, and she said it was everyone who ever chose truth over comfort. Everyone who ever stood at a threshold and decided not to cross back into the easier lie. Eleanor stood beside him, looking at the painted woman's face, at the strength and sorrow captured in equal measure. Outside, the village continued its ordinary rhythms, but inside this room, something had shifted. Not resolved, nothing could resolve decades of silence and abandonment, but acknowledged, made visible, given the weight of witness. When the last visitors departed as evening approached, Eleanor walked through the empty gallery, seeing the paintings now as Catherine might have seen them, not as vindication or revenge, but as simple evidence of a life lived with integrity, of a vision that refused to compromise itself for acceptance. The mansion settled into quietness around her, no longer quite so haunted, no longer quite so heavy with unspoken grief. The decision to stay came not in a single moment but through an accumulation of mornings when Eleanor woke in the mansion and couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The building had changed around her, or perhaps she had changed within it, so that rooms that once felt oppressive with silence now seemed simply quiet, waiting to be filled with purpose rather than haunted by absence. She found herself sketching plans on the backs of envelopes, imagining how the eastern wing could become a studio, how the gallery space could remain open for rotating exhibitions, how Catherine's vision could continue to unfold even after her death. The practical work of conversion gave structure to days that might otherwise have dissolved into reflection. Eleanor hired local contractors, men and women from the village who arrived with tools and curious glances, their presence gradually domesticating the mansion's intimidating grandeur. She watched them measure and plan, discussing load-bearing walls and natural light with a professional focus that seemed to absolve them of any need to acknowledge the building's complicated history. They were simply doing their work, and in that simple doing they were helping Eleanor do hers. Her mother's second visit arrived without warning on a Tuesday afternoon when autumn was just beginning to assert itself, the air carrying that particular crispness that promised change. Eleanor was in what would become the studio, directing the installation of track lighting, when she heard the front door open and her mother's familiar footsteps in the hall, hesitant but determined, the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed this arrival multiple times before actually attempting it. She appeared in the doorway carrying a cardboard box that looked old enough to be fragile, its corners reinforced with yellowed tape. "I should have brought these to the exhibition," she said without preamble, her voice carrying none of its usual careful modulation. "But I wasn't ready then. I think I'm ready now." Inside the box were photographs Eleanor had never seen. Images of Catherine as a young woman, laughing with her arm around Eleanor's mother, both of them dressed in the styles of decades past, their faces unguarded in a way that spoke of genuine affection. There were letters too, exchanges between the sisters from before the rupture, full of small observations about daily life, teasing comments, the accumulated intimacy of people who had grown up finishing each other's sentences. They sat together on the floor of the unfinished studio, the contractors politely taking an extended break, and Eleanor's mother narrated the photographs with a voice that grew steadier as she continued. This was at the summer festival the year before everything happened. Catherine had just sold her first painting, a landscape to a tourist from Boston. She was so proud, so certain it was the beginning of something. And it was, just not the way any of us expected. Eleanor held a photograph of Catherine at maybe 25. Her face tilted toward the camera with an expression of such open joy that it felt almost painful to witness, knowing what would come after. "She was beautiful," Eleanor said quietly. "She was herself," her mother corrected, and something in her tone suggested this was a hard-won understanding, a distinction that had taken decades to grasp. That was what made people uncomfortable. She was so completely herself, without apology or performance. I envied that even as I was afraid of it. The afternoon stretched into evening as they went through the box's contents, each item a small act of restitution, of memory retrieved from the deliberate forgetting that had defined so many years. When her mother finally left, She embraced Eleanor with an intensity that felt like both apology and plea, and Eleanor held her back, understanding that forgiveness was not a single act but a process, something they would both have to choose repeatedly in the time ahead. Thomas began appearing at the mansion 2 or 3 times a week, arriving with the punctuality of someone who had claimed these visits as a kind of ritual. He would walk through the gallery, sometimes spending long minutes before a particular painting, sometimes moving through quickly as if simply confirming they were still there. Then he would find Eleanor wherever she was working and offer assistance. Holding a ladder steady, helping move furniture, performing small repairs with the competence of someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. They spoke little during these visits, but the silence between them was comfortable, productive, the kind that comes when 2 people are united in common purpose, rather than divided by the need to fill emptiness with words. Once, while they were hanging a new set of paintings Eleanor had discovered in the attic, smaller works, studies and experiments Catherine had done, Thomas paused and said, "She would have liked you very much. You have her stubbornness, her refusal to accept easy answers." Eleanor had smiled, feeling the weight of that assessment as both burden and gift. "I wish I'd known her." "You do know her," Thomas replied, gesturing at the walls surrounding them. "You know her better than most people who actually met her, because you've paid attention to what she made, what she saw. That's more intimate than small talk at village gatherings ever could have been." In the evenings, after the contractors left and Thomas returned to his cottage, Eleanor found herself drawn to the studio space with increasing frequency. She had set up an easel there, more as decoration than with any real intention, but one night she found herself standing before it with a canvas positioned and ready, a palette in her hand that she didn't quite remember preparing. She had abandoned painting years ago, telling herself she lacked talent, that it was an impractical pursuit, that there were more sensible ways to spend time. But standing in Catherine's mansion, surrounded by her aunt's refusal to compromise vision for practicality, Eleanor felt those old justifications crack and fall away. She made the first mark on the canvas without thinking, a line that suggested the curve of the harbor visible from the window. Then another line and another until she was working with a focus that felt both foreign and deeply familiar, like remembering a language she had once spoken fluently. The painting that emerged over the following weeks was clumsy in places, overworked in others, but it was hers, her vision, her seeing, her small act of creation in a world that often seemed to value only consumption. She worked on it late into the evenings, and sometimes when she stepped back to assess progress, she could almost feel Catherine's presence in the room, not as a ghost but as a kind of permission, a reminder that making art was itself an act of courage, of insisting that one's interior life mattered enough to be made external. The mansion transformed around her industry. Where it had been a monument to silence, it became a space humming with the quiet activity of making and remembering. Catherine's paintings continued to draw occasional visitors, word of the exhibition spreading slowly through coastal communities, bringing strangers who left moved by work they hadn't known existed. Eleanor greeted them, told Catherine's story when asked, and watched them leave carrying some small piece of her aunt's vision with them into the world. She had come to this place looking for an inheritance and found instead a calling, not to preserve the past exactly, but to let it live forward, to transform grief and silence into something generative. The mansion was no longer just Catherine's. It was becoming Eleanor's too, a space where their 2 lives overlapped across time, where courage recognized courage, where the choice to be truthful rather than comfortable could echo and amplify and perhaps inspire others to make similar choices. Outside, the village continued its rhythms, but Eleanor no longer felt separate from it. She was part of its story now, just as Catherine had been, and she carried that belonging not as burden but as strange, complicated gift, the inheritance not of money or property, but of purpose discovered through the patient work of witnessing another's life and finding, in that witnessing, permission to more fully inhabit her own.